Imagine a world where more women had the time and resources to fully explore their genius. Welcome to She Rebel Radio, a community-driven podcast dedicated to supporting women to unlearn conventional rules and create businesses of significance. This is our International Women's Day series, bringing you insights and advice from noteworthy women entrepreneurs here in the UK who strive to create more meaning, impact and purpose. Our headline partner for this podcast series is NatWest. NatWest have been a pioneer in supporting women in business since the publication of the Rose Review in 2019, which identified the disparity between male and female entrepreneurs when starting a business. NatWest have been implementing key interventions and providing essential wraparound support to realise the unrealised potential of female founders. My name is Lulu Minns. I host retreats and create spaces for entrepreneurial women to explore their genius. And today I'm going to create that same space for you right here on this podcast episode. Welcome to episode 89 of She Rebel Radio, the currency of compassion. I hope you've enjoyed the wisdom and intellect part of this series. And for the next 3 episodes, we're going to be diving into kindness and compassion. We have 2 entrepreneurs who are supported by NatWest and the Business Hub. Lucy Jeffrey talking to us about her sock currency, and Vic Wood, a greener revolution in the beauty industry. And to set the scene for these 2 amazing guests that we've got coming up, we're going to talk about the currency of compassion. Currency is a system of money used and accepted somewhere. So we're going to explore the old currency and how that is connected or created around money and power, and explore a little bit as to why that might be. Secondly, we're going to look at why we as women often feel disconnected from that and lack those essential role models, which again, the Rose Review highlighted in its findings that women really feel that we lack the role models within business, but also the role models within the current currency, the power structures that we rely on in society that we do see coming under quite a bit of pressure in modern times. And thirdly, what does a currency of compassion look like for us as a collective, but also for you as an individual or for you as your business or business idea? Now, in the last episode, we heard from the incredible Dr. Sharon Blackie, and we explored our connection to land as women and that wisdom of land and the wisdom of women. And interestingly, in the summer of 2021, I went back to my homeland of Wales. Now, I wasn't born in Wales. I was born in Brighton, but my mum is from Wales, and both of her parents were from there and had their entire childhoods there, because my mum left at the age of 2 and travelled around with her parents. But for the first 7 years of my life, my holidays were seeing my grandma in Wales, in Brecon. And when she eventually left there, she ended up moving in with us in Brighton. I hadn't gone back there since I was 7 years old until this summer. And because I was living down in Cornwall at the time, which is where our holidays moved to when we were no longer able to go to Wales, and I didn't go abroad until my early teens, I travelled all the way kind of out and up from Wales, stopping over, going past Stonehenge, some more ancient land, seeing a very good friend of mine in Wiltshire, and driving from the south of Wales all the way up to Snowdonia in the north. Now, the south is the area that I know, that I remember as a child. And it was so interesting driving around, recognising some of the Welsh language, which I really can't speak. Unlike Sharon Blackie, has such good pronunciation, etc. And to visit that homeland and that place that I was so connected with as a child and have those ancestral roots within. And on my way back, actually, I stopped in Brecon and the Brecon Beacons, which is where my grandmother used to live, and recalled a story that my mum told me about one of my famous questions that I used to ask as a child. It's no wonder that I've had a career of asking questions from my coaching clients at retreats. It's all about the questioning, particularly with our group coaching day, asking the right questions. And as a lawyer, I was told by one of my law tutors when I first stood up to do a practice cross-examination, I literally asked 3 questions, sat down, that was it. And she said, you're ready to go. Less is more, as we discovered with the lesser of whys. So I love asking questions, and I always have done ever since I was a child, and quite often they were difficult questions for grown-ups to answer. Sometimes they were silly questions that caused my parents no end of entertainment, and this was kind of one of them, but there was a profoundness and a depth in this question. So my grandmother's house was opposite. You could kind of see some of the Brecon Beacons, and I really wanted to find her house when I went back there in the summer, but it was knocked down years ago and a roundabout put over the top of it, but I couldn't recall the exact direction it was in, but I definitely remembered other areas. Like I found the river there that I used to love as a child, and the town itself was much bigger than I remember, but she was opposite the river, and you could see up on the beacons with the sheep in Wales, and there were so many sheep when I drove south to north and north back to south, everywhere. And I asked my mum why those men hitting those sheep with sticks. That's the question that I asked her, and she laughed and said they're playing golf, because there was a golf course up on near the beacons. So the perspective and the angle that we were at, kind of down looking up, looked like one of the men was hitting the poor sheep with a stick, but he was literally trying to find his golf ball and getting his aim right for that. So but an interesting question for a child, again showing that compassion for animals that came so naturally to me. And I, over Christmas, found I got really emotional on 2 occasions. As I came back to Sussex, I was driving along, I'd been to the supermarket, and there was a seagull in the road that was obviously injured, and everyone was driving around it. And I drove around it, and then I was like, I should have stopped, I should maybe picked it up, but I can be a bit squeamish and silly about things like that. And it would have been dangerous to stop in the road, but I just, this seagull's vulnerability made me really emotional in terms of just sitting there and waiting for that person that wouldn't drive round or was busy or distracted in their car and would just, go straight over it, which might have actually been the kinder thing to do in terms of the injury, and its survival stakes were probably not very high. And then a few days later, there was a guy, I went to the bus stop where I live. I was going out for a few glasses of wine, etc. And there was a guy who was collapsed in the street, and people around him helping him up. The ambulance was there, so he was being looked after. But again, I just felt this like flood of emotion, and was thinking about this She Rebel Radio series, thinking about compassion and how much that when we see the vulnerability of others, we can ask ourselves or think, I'm just being silly. Why am I being silly? But actually, compassion is not a weakness. It's a power. And it's the suffering of others where we can really find compassion within ourselves. And sometimes it's the suffering of ourself where we can really find compassion with others. So it's really important to connect with that compassion and feel grateful, when we have it, because the old currency that we have structured society and business around hasn't really been built around compassion. It's really been built around money and power. And that's interesting. We're talking about this at a time where we're looking at Ukraine and Russia fighting over land and territory and this money and power and who owns what. And, by the time this episode goes live, I don't know where we'll be with that, but it's a concern for all of us. And I feel like the old currency of money and power and who owns what, a lot of that has been centered around some of the notion of evolution, the mechanism of natural selection, of survival of the fittest, which actually was not a term coined by Darwin. It was by Herbert Spencer, who kind of bought into more of the social aspects rather than the biological aspects. And, is a term that I think, society has really held onto, that survival of the fittest, that competition over collaboration, and that profit over purpose. This kind of model of more, expansion over contraction. And most of the role models for that old currency have been men or a masculine way of thinking, which something diving into our second question, us as women often don't connect with because we didn't create it. And we can, unfortunately as well, what I've found in terms of supporting women and my own relationship with it is, that relationship sometimes with money and power can be negative because we have seen maybe it used in a way that we don't respect, in a way that we can't relate to. So we can stay away from potentially having that money or having that power. And I was watching over the weekend, actually, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I know I bring all sorts of random stuff into this, but I'm so interested in watching, and listening to things that I did as a child. And I loved that as a teenager. And they brought out the new Bill and Ted, didn't they? A couple of years ago or 18 months ago, where it was their daughters who were, having the heroine's journey, etc., because it was a hero's journey. And as a teenager, it didn't occur to me at the time, it's only now looking back at it, that I was like, all the women in it were stupid, were quite silly. They were historical babes, as they called them, within it. And as Bill and Ted go out on this adventure to collect historical figures for their history project from school, they are all, bar one of them, men. Not women, apart from the Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was the only woman within that. And again, she's on her own. She's on a spiritual quest. She's, not part of a community, etc. But the rest were Billy the Kid, Genghis Khan, President Lincoln, Napoleon, Sigmund Freud. And these were presented as, this was the best person in this. And this was the best, musician, Mozart, etc. The best, just taken to be the best, the role model for this, which were all men and all masculine with this old currency of history, which is why this old currency of money and power is something that so often us women cannot connect with, and why we can lack role models within business and wider systems of money and power. We really have to go and look for those role models. Now, with this episode, I'm really interested in starting to explore, before we meet our two guests, Lucy Jeffrey and Vic Wood, and it has been a narrative that we've continued to share on She Rebel Radio, in terms of, purpose over profit. We had Laura from Votch, the vegan watch company, in our last International Women's Day series. And this element of kindness and compassion. And it's a real misconception, actually, that I was reading about recently, that Charles Darwin, when looking at our evolution, the human evolution and our biological evolution, that he, as we've heard, firstly didn't coin the term the survival of the fittest. He apparently then used it later, but he really talked about this survival of the kindest, and compassion being an ever-present instinct in each and every one of us, that cooperation and collaboration is even more important than competition in human evolution, that to become from small tribes to larger civilizations, to be civilized, we need to be kind and have care and compassion for others, that there is a currency to compassion. The Dalai Lama at the Peace Summit, and we talked to Dr. Sharon Blackie about the statement that Western women will save civilization, and a far more accurate statement, and one we massively support on She Rebel, is that women will save civilization. We've got lots to learn from our native sisters and their stories. But even within that, the Dalai Lama talks about, that women are more sensitive to the suffering of others, the more empathy and compassion. And it's not necessarily, I feel like it's women, it's more accepted that we're more socialized to do that, to care for others. It's more acceptable. It's more feminine traits, again, that Dr. Sharon Blackie talks about, that I've spent a number of years talking about. It's those feminine aspects and traits that we all have, whether male, whether female, that we need to bring in more of into these systems of structure and power and the currencies that we involve ourselves in and we relate ourselves to. And currency also has a other meanings in terms of it's to circulate. There's movement, there's fluidity. It's a prevailing, kind of thought, idea, or a quality of something that's been accepted. So there's flow there, which I often talk about as being a feminine principle over static, collaboration over competition, a feminine principle, because we live in a world that tends to value the more patriarchal, masculine side of things, which is kind of like an energetic thing, because as Sharon Blackie said, and I'm going to repeat here, we all have masculine and feminine traits, but how do we bring more of the feminine one in? And that really is that compassion and kindness piece. And how do we make that a currency that prevails, that circulates, that moves markets, that there is a fluidity to that and a flow? And I feel like there are so many women and men really bringing in this currency of compassion. But again, as we've talked about in this podcast, it's women's voices that have not been heard, that have been shut down. So standing on sacred ground and using our voices, asking the question, if we see that, why are men, or why are those men hitting sheep with sticks? Even if it's perhaps a wrong perception at that time, it's not always about the answers. It's also about asking the right questions and, adjusting our perspective. I was standing in the wrong space, so I couldn't see fully what was going on, but I was brave and bold enough as a young child to ask the question. So, we must ask those questions. And I'm going to ask you questions, some journaling tools before we leave today's episode of The Currency of Compassion. So, as I've said here, suffering, when we see suffering, that equals our compassion for others. And by definition, the compassion means, the concern for other people's suffering. But we also have to bear in mind our own, because that could be a real key and fuel to your business. And it's also a starting point. We can only be as compassionate to others if we start to show more compassion for ourselves, which again, with women, sometimes our conditioning is to put everyone else's needs before our own. And we need to flip that on its head. So the questions that I'm going to ask you today, so grab your pen and journal. If you're driving or doing something else, as always, don't do that if it's dangerous, and listen back to this episode. And as always, come back and listen to this episode once you've heard from our two guests as well, because there will be real food for thought there. There's some movement within, the currency that you may be considering within your business, within your life plan, etc. So the first question is, what suffering have I been through recently or in the past? What suffering have I been through recently or in the past? Number 2, how can I show more compassion for myself and others? And thirdly, what would that look like as part of my business currency? What would that look like as part of my business currency? So many people have asked me the question, and it only really, really sunk in when I was preparing this episode for you, is that why I host retreats for women. Because as I said, I've been asked that before. And it really sunk in for me that, just asking these questions, which come very intuitively to me, as they do when I'm creating retreats for the women that we host them for, and it's all about directing you to those right answers. That when I take myself through this process, it was like, my real suffering in the past is when I was stuck in the legal profession, in that feeling that patriarchal wasteland that we talked about in the previous episode, feeling like I couldn't fully relate to the role models above me, and this system and structure that existed way before I was part of it, and that any other woman was part of it as well, that I found really real suffering within that. And I quit that without any real plan, without any real knowledge of how to run a business, as to whether it was the right business for me. And, I needed to find compassion for myself and not go into the push, and B, found compassion for other women experiencing that, which is why I hold retreats and host spaces for them to explore all of these things in a really safe space, in a narrative and conversation that they can relate to come to the answers of actually what it is that they want to do in the world, and how they can show up and how they can take it to the next level if they're already doing that. So that's really connected to that third question. What would that look like as a currency in my business. You know, a big currency in my business is hosting the retreats, and, you know, how we can support more and more women to do that, and support more and more women to do that who are maybe not in a position financially or family-wise to take that time out. What does that look like? You know, and that's one reason why my business partner and I are bringing our online healing and empowerment events for women for the solstices and the equinoxes. So, and as I've said, you're going to hear from our incredible guests about Lucy's sock currency and Vic Wood's greener revolution with the beauty industry, and how, you know, that compassion has become really part of their business currency. And I would also advise you, or recommend, advice sounds very serious, to listen to Laura Way's episode on Finding a Kinder Way, which is about vegan watches. So have a listen to those. Come back to these questions, really look at where you've been suffering recently or maybe in the past, how you can show yourself more compassion and kindness. And Selma Studer and I in the Wisdom of Sound were talking about that, you know, how to soften and find compassion for ourselves around that. So all of these episodes will interlink. How to find more compassion for yourself and others, and what would that look like as part of a currency within your business for this new way, this new paradigm where, you know, both women and men can really lead in this way, but it's a real space where us as women can use our voices. Amazing to be with you. Do enjoy our guests, and I look forward to returning with you soon. You've been listening to She Rebel Radio. It's been an honour to support you taking the time to discover more of your genius, and we thank our partners NatWest for supporting this series. Since the publication of the Rose Review, NatWest have been working to deliver real support for women to create their business of significance. From launching the Investing in Women Code to backing $1 billion of female entrepreneurship funding, NatWest are also educating young women through Dream Bigger, inspiring the future generations of female entrepreneurs. From their Business Builder online course to their flagship Accelerator program, NatWest can support you to upskill at your own pace in a way that allows you to stay in control as you start, scale, and succeed. Visit www.natwestbusinesshub.com for more. If you'd like to attend a retreat with me, visit luluminns.com, and don't forget to join us in furthering the conversation on social media. Just search for NatWest Business or Lulu Minns in Google and on all social media platforms.